My uncle was the district attorney in Kings County during the cotton strike of 1933. And that was the biggest agricultural strike in American history, where all the cotton pickers from Madera to Bakersfield went out on strike. The center of the strike was Corcoran. The growers had thrown the workers out of the camps. The workers had created an instant camp over on the east side of Corcoran. My uncle was, as I say, under a lot of pressure from the growers to close the camp down. I know he ordered it closed. I'd forgotten whether it actually closed or not. But I always felt that, some need to sort of rebalance that equation. So there had been, I guess, in my background, things that predisposed me to, these interest in farm workers and economic justice stuff, which I did then the rest of my career. I went to Yale, and in the spring of 1960, we did a symposium at Yale where we had a bunch of prominent speakers. We had 2,500 students from the Northeast show up. Pete Seeger and Odetta were sort of the cultural part of it. And halfway through the thing, a guy showed up from North Carolina and said, students are sitting in North Carolina, I want to talk about it. So at about 11 o'clock at night, Al Lowenstein, who later became a congressman, who was then working for the National Student Association, started talking about the sit-ins in the South, and he had just come back. So what was going on in my life was, frankly, my interest had really been more economic, more labor movement issues. I ended up there in Tulare County because that's where I'd been working in the summers and where I had friends and relatives. The American Friends Service Committee was really an opportunity for me to go work on issues that I had been concerned about, but it really come out of that earlier period. This all begins with the American Friends Service Committee, which is the action arm of Society of Friends, the Quakers. In 1955, the American Friends Service Committee decided it was going to run a farm labor project. They hired a guy named Bard McAllister, who was a conscientious objector in World War II, not a Quaker at the time, although he later became one. The program had no content at the time. They just knew they were going to work with farm workers. And there had been a major flood in the winter of 1955 in Tulare County, and the place was a mess. And based on that, they selected Tulare County, and that decision in itself really sparked the chain of events that led to the formation of RCAC. Bard was spending about one day a week in a town called Teviston in southern Tulare County, where he was working with community leaders on trying to get a water system for Teviston, a project that took forever. I remember at one point saying, Bard, you've been going down there for 5 years, once a week. They still don't have water. What would happen if we got about 10 people, went down there with shovels and put in a water system over a weekend? And Bard wisdom, he said, then they'd have water, but they wouldn't have a community. He said they'd have our water, not their water. And when they're ready, they'll get their own water system. And they did indeed. But that project in Teviston was the origin of the water and sewer work of later Self-Help Enterprises and then later Rural Community Assistance Corporation. Bard went in and talked to a woman named Charlotte Mack. Charlotte was a rich widow and generous widow in San Francisco. She funded the first years of self-help housing personally. Bard was a great storyteller, but would whittle while he was telling stories. And so as he sat there whittling, and Mrs. Mack was an art collector. Her art collection's now at Mills College. And she said, I'll give you the money you need for this if you'll give me the thing that you're whittling. And so somewhere in the Charlotte Mack collection, there was a Bard McAllister. She gave the American Friends Service Committee enough money to start the housing project. Bard then went and hired Howard Washburn, and Howard was at that time a building contractor up in Oakhurst in Madera County. Howard and his wife Patsy moved to Visalia, and began the housing project. The key piece in making self-help housing work in the early days was changes in the federal housing law that enabled farm workers to be treated like farmers for purposes of 30-year mortgages. There was kind of a bursting of energy that the American Friends Service Committee project was a little ahead of. What you had were the coinciding of the civil rights movement, the power of Edward R. Murrow's film, The Harvest of Shame, the growth of the Chicano movement. All of this was coming together at the same time, and in the San Joaquin Valley. That all came belly up in 1966 when Howard Washburn, his wife, and 2 daughters were killed in an automobile accident on their way to their summer vacation. I mean, the interesting thing is here you have the founder of the organization killed, you know, a year or 2 into the creation of the new organization, but by that time Bob Marshall had been hired. They had quite a stable program, stable funding base. So the elements that remained the core part of self-help enterprises were already in place, and you know, that continued up until the late 1970s. Reading from the 1978 annual report of the Rosenberg Foundation, self-help enterprises is now proposing to organize a separate corporation which will assume the housing advocacy, housing technical assistance, and rural policy functions previously carried out by the community development program of self-help enterprises. So that $15,000 grant enabled self-help enterprises to create and spin off Rural Community Assistance Corporation.
I was 18 when I was drafted. During World War II, I was a conscientious objector, did what they called public service. I stuck with that, and I was in the smoke jumpers unit in Montana, fighting forest fires with a group that jumped on into the area near where the fire was. Yeah. I was in 6 different units in a 3-year period. So I got thrown with men from all sorts of backgrounds, and that broadened my view. There were people who were from just about every church, some who were not religiously motivated, but philosophically. So I got a broad education. I grew up a Quaker, as did my wife. Quakers have believed in social justice for all and working in your life to have meaning for that concept that everybody is equal. There's that of God in every person. Sometimes hard to make it real, but in my life I had tried teaching, and in 1952 I was hired by the Friends Neighborhood Guild in Philadelphia to work on a self-help housing program that they were doing in the city. As a result of working there, I was invited to a conference that the American Friends Service Committee was holding in Virginia. There I met Howard Washburn from the California project that had just got started in Goshen. Howard said that if I was interested at some future date in coming to work for them, they were expecting to expand the program with funds from the Office of Economic Opportunity. A year later, when they actually did get that expanded funding, he called me in and said, "Why don't you come out and have a look?" So I flew out in the summer and stayed with the Washburn family for 4 or 5 days. I liked what I saw and went back, told my wife and family about it. They said, "That's a big change. We'll try it for 2 years." So we packed up and drove out here, August of 1966. We came down Highway 99, and it was over 100 degrees. The Washburns had said, "We're going to be away on vacation for 2 weeks, just stay in our house." So we pulled into their house. The kids jumped in their swimming pool. We'd been there about an hour, and Howard's mother, who was living in a house 2 or 3 doors down, came over in tears and said, they've been killed. They had a head-on auto accident. Howard, his wife, 2 of the 4 daughters were killed, and 2 of the daughters survived. It was just heartbreaking because he was the person that I knew, and that was tough. This was on a weekend, and I figured Monday I'm going to go in and find out what's happening. When I started here, working with the Farmers Home Administration, there were difficulties in getting families' loans approved. They had to go before a county committee, which was composed generally of 3 farmers. That was oftentimes difficult because they didn't view these farm workers as being capable of being homeowners. So that was one problem. After a few years, we were able to get the Farmers Hub Administration to not use the county committees in the processing of loans, so that made it easier. The second problem was obtaining and developing land. Initially, it was buy a lot here and a lot there, but as we got larger and more organized, it became necessary to develop subdivisions. The USDA decided to establish agencies in about 8 areas of the country that would operate as trainers and, to some extent, overseers of self-help housing programs and related groups. I was not interested in seeing us take on 6 states or whatever. Bill French, who had been my assistant, was interested in making that move, even though it was going to drain some of our key staff. We felt that it was best to make that break. Also, Bill French invited me to come on that initial board of directors of his, so we maintained that contact. Well, I have kept fairly close watch over self-help enterprises. I go to their groundbreakings and other things, and I would say that they're doing an excellent job. Recently went to a celebration in Goshen where this whole thing started, and they were dedicating the second phase of rental housing for low-income folks. There will be a health clinic built there in the next couple of years. They have a community building with computers and place for people to meet and even have meals. All of this has taken the program steps further than when I retired. They continue with small unincorporated communities with the sewer and water improvements that they've been doing for years, recognizing all the time the families who are living there. I don't see any change in the philosophy or direction. All I see is good movement ahead.
When I was in architecture school, I was at Berkeley. In the late 60s, the university got a small grant to work on designing some new temporary housing for farm labor camps. And I had an intern job working on that project. That was sort of the first awareness that I had of kind of the rural condition. My architecture training taught me how to design and build things, which I think are skills that led me to be so successful in developing RCAC, because it was like you were building a building and making design decisions. It was about creativity. I was drafted when I was still in college, just ready to graduate, is what they did, how they did that to you. You know, personally, I just wasn't going to go shoot people. When I became a CO, I had written a letter to every planning department in California trying to find some job that wouldn't be working as a hospital orderly somewhere. Wound up a letter in the Fresno planning department, which got to a guy named Yuneo Ono, he was also on the board of Self-Help Enterprises. I came to work at Self-Help Enterprises in 1968. My job was to create new programs, new ideas. Self-help housing is a way to provide shelter, yes. But it's not a very efficient way to provide shelter. Robert Kennedy did a visit at Self-Help Enterprises. He sort of said, yeah, this is fun, this is interesting, but it's not enough. It's not going to build enough houses. But self-help housing does much more than just build a house. It's designed to empower the residents to be able to control their housing. And through that process, you change people. This is like 1972, 1973. Funding was tight. At that point, it was a really tough time. And at Self-Help Enterprises, no new stuff. I describe it as keeping your head below the berm. In 74, all of a sudden things started to change. The government came out with a huge stimulus program. What they did is they just said, in the federal government, we're going to increase everybody's budget by a big chunk of extra money. And all of a sudden, at Self-Help Enterprises, instead of having your kind of nose below the berm, you're standing on top of it, waving your hand, saying, here we are. Hey, let's do some stuff. I started putting back on my innovation hat, and we started looking at doing some new things. So we're being very successful at Self-Help Enterprises with this rural development program, really pushing to the limits. And then you had Farmers Home Administration coming in saying they wanted to create this concept of a regional group to do technical assistance. So March of 78, the Self-Help Enterprises had a retreat kind of thing. We sort of started talking about this concept of maybe spinning off this separate entity to go and do this community development stuff broader scale. On a motion made by Everett Krakoff, who was on the board, he's this old guy from the farm security days, the board approved the creation of RCAC. When RCAC started, the funding source just said, you guys are out there doing good things, here's the money. And there were some program definitions that came along with it, but not much. In those days, if you had a good idea at OEO, you'd get funded to give it a shot, to give it a try. There was innovation. People were interested in broader things. Now it's much more prescribed. You apply for money to do a certain thing. What's happened over the years, in my 30 years of working at RCAC, the innovation went out of the system. And yeah, we were bigger, we were a lot more successful, we had a lot of money, a lot of programs going on, but we were filling a prescription. Well, the change in funding structure came about as the political response to a set of more conservative presidents, from Ronald Reagan to Nixon to Bush. It still maintained itself under Carter and Clinton. In the 60s, you had an image of this country of kind of opening up groups. We're moving forward, we're going to be inclusive. The Economic Opportunity Act was really about empowering people to do stuff on their own. The farm labor movement in California and the Farm Workers Union was really a thing about empowering people, and the politics sort of allowed the creation of all that, including RCAC. But now, you don't have that. Now you have a political system which doesn't allow that kind of behavior at all. One of the reasons why RCAC was so successful starting off, you didn't have anti-immigrant kind of hysteria. You didn't have racism towards Hispanics going on. That really may have been underneath, but it wasn't there. It really wasn't there. You had these small Hispanic communities, and nobody was saying don't give them anything because they're Hispanic. Now if that was going on, if you were trying to organize groups of farm workers, somebody would say, oh, they're illegals, they're this, they're that. The spirit in this country is so different today from the way it was in the 60s. Part of the thing about working for RCAC that was so much fun is you got to get assigned to work in some of the most beautiful places and most interesting places around. I mean, the rural West is just full. Every place you go and you meet a group of people, they all claim that they live in God's country. Their place is special and nobody else, would want to live anywhere but where they live. And that's what rural people are like. That's why rural community development is so successful, is because you have people who wind up living someplace and they want to be there. They want to be there. And they want to make their place better to live in, but they don't want to go somewhere else. They want to be there.
I did 5 years of college, one of which was a year overseas, and took rural sociology. And I said, oh, this is really interesting. So I came back to the States and I chose to go into Vista. So they shipped me off to Wisconsin, and I had a wonderful experience with a community action agency working with senior citizens. And now that I had figured out what I wanted to do, I didn't have a degree in it. So I had heard rumor that UC Davis, where I had graduated, was going to be offering a master's in community development. And so that sounded terrific. I first started working for RCAC in 1979 as a rural development specialist. There weren't more than about 6, maybe a dozen people at the most in the company. And it was a fascinating place to work with in that it was a very egalitarian type organization. Everything was done by consensus. So theoretically, in the consensus model, I as a peon could have rejected totally something that Stan wanted to do. And there were some knockdown, drag-out discussions in the early days. I mean, we had our own little community going at RCAC, so it was like a practice run for being out there in the community. It was a new concept to provide TA in rural America. One of the major differences between urban and rural areas, in rural areas with a scarcer population, we don't often have the money, the access to resources and information. So if we had an entity that was providing that, that would make the link for rural areas to access federal programs. You wouldn't think self-help housing would be all that controversial because it's a sweat equity program, it's people helping themselves, it's not a giveaway. Up in Yuba City, in the early days I was trying to work with a group on farm worker housing. We had to go before the Planning Commission to get the project approved, and in the neighborhood there were signs of last chance to stop farm worker housing, come to the hearing. So, you know, I thought I was in some movie set when I showed up at this commission meeting and heard these people just starting to talk almost at racist level, saying they don't belong here. When the Planning Commission denied the project, the entity, all they had to do was take pictures of the signs and go to federal court. The judge ruled in their favor. This is an obvious case of discrimination and the project is in compliance, you will build it. Well, I think our mission when the organization first started was much more aware of trying to work with the most disadvantaged. It could be the most economically disadvantaged, it could be the most socially disadvantaged. But the idea was the assistance was meant to help those least likely or least able to help themselves. Nowadays, it's a mission statement that still talks about helping communities identify what their needs are, and we now talk about resources and information and funding. But it seems to have a slightly different focus. So, for example, with the Department of Labor money, we used to be focused more on nonprofit organizations providing farm worker housing. Now we're working with larger growers to provide housing for farm workers. And there's a need on both sides, but helping an employer be able to meet his labor need rather than looking at the person on the other side saying, look, you need decent housing. So it's a different perspective and coming at it from a different angle. I think we're still okay, so to speak, in terms of the self-help housing because we still use the mortgage product that has a subsidy, and we have a program requirement that 40% of the houses built have to serve 50% or less of median. So we're trying to get at the lower income folks who are not as able to get into home ownership. I think that's got the social perspective that I find attractive. I don't feel like I've worked for the same organization for 33 years. Because it's also different. It's just always been a really neat place to try something new or grow or change. I mean, they've given me so many opportunities to do something different. That's why I say I can't believe I've been with the same organization because I've held so many different jobs. So for me, right now, at the end of my career, having the opportunity to go on out to the Western Pacific is like international community development, which I always thought maybe if I had a lot of experience in the States, that someday I would have something to offer back again in another country. The neat thing is I can still keep my house and my kids, my golden retrievers are my kids, in Washington, and I can go out and work with people, and then I come back and, I get the best of both worlds.
In 1973, when I went to Self-Help Enterprises, the standard way that a low-income family got to buy a house was they would have what was called a contract of sale. You make all the payments on this house for the next 20 years. The deed stayed in the name of the owner. Slumlords, we used to call them. I mean, that's really all they were, was slumlords, and the family made payments. The first time that the family didn't make a payment, the owner canceled the contract and would evict them, then would go out and sell the house to another person on a contract of sale. It happened time and again and time again. A family would migrate, well, they still had to have a place to come back to. So you needed a home base. You needed a home that was your home, right? But nobody would lend to them because of the nature of their employment. So what Self-Help Enterprises really was doing was providing another way that low-income people could actually access home ownership. And actually, having a home made it also possible that the family could stay and the dad could migrate, or nobody would migrate. It helped to settle people out of the migrant stream as well. And there were numerous programs that came out of the war on poverty. Folks were looking at comprehensive ways of dealing with both the poverty and the unemployment that existed in the seasonal unemployment. As the UFW was pushing for a decent work environment, respect for the workers, and a decent wage, unemployment insurance, and health insurance, Self-Help Enterprises was pushing for housing that was of standard quality and building communities that really would be decent places for people to live as well. And so there was no question, but you had these two parallel tracks that we were going down, trying to change a very patron-type system, right, which started with the Bracero program, which, they brought in workers from Mexico who would come for a period of time and then they would send them back, and there was still that same kind of hierarchy that existed in the agricultural society. And I can't tell you the number of times that I met with a grower who would say, all of my employees are migrants. Because to him, they only worked for him for a short period of time. So he didn't really give a damn where they lived when they didn't work for him. He didn't care. He figured they just moved on, when in reality, they still lived in that community. They weren't migrants. They were seasonal employees of his. As long as workers came to pick the crops, what did they care? That was all they were really interested in. When you do housing development, you basically have to work within an existing power framework, right? You have to be able to get land use entitlements. You have to be able to get zoning. You have to get public support for the kinds of projects that you're trying to do. So to be closely aligned with an advocacy and organizing effort like the UFW would have been death for Self-Help Enterprises, because the union, the United Farm Workers, was seen as a threat to that power structure, and we were trying to work with it to achieve the same goals as the Farm Worker Union was trying to achieve. Self-Help Enterprises was building home ownership opportunities, but there wasn't that much of that work that was being done throughout the Western United States. One of the really strong motivators for RCAC was to try and take the work that we had been doing in Visalia and in the San Joaquin Valley and to begin building a network of organizations that could be more effective at doing similar kinds of work across the West. When we started in '78, there were probably 5 or 6 self-help housing organizations in the West outside of California. Today, there are 45. And frankly, that is a testament to the good work of this organization.